Welcome back to the channel. Harvard University recently asked the New York Times science reporter Apurva Mandavili to give a talk about misinformation and how it ought to be handled going forward. That would be great if this reporter actually were good at her job, but she's committed many errors during the COVID-19 pandemic, always unidirectional errors. We're going to talk about that. Always errors that exaggerate the risk to children and promote the policies that she likes, school closure and masking young children. I'm going to run through some of her errors, why those are completely disqualifying for any science reporter, why the New York Times is not taking more action against these sloppy reporting, and we'll talk about all that. But first I want to tell you, the New York Times used to have a reporter that actually did his job well. His name was Don McNeil. He was fired during the pandemic for some off-color remarks he said many years before, and I think he had already been punished for those remarks. This is, again, crazy. I think what he said was probably in poor taste. It's old news. You shouldn't be firing people for stray comments they made years ago and replacing them with completely incompetent journalists. But that's what happened here. So let's talk about things Apurva Mandavili said over the last few years in the pandemic that were just completely and totally wrong. When you see the magnitude of her errors, you're going to ask yourself, why is she still employed at the New York Times? So let's go number one. This is a Twitter quote. Someday we will stop talking about the lab leak theory and maybe even admit its racist roots. But alas, that day is not here. So early in the pandemic in 2021, she, the journalist, decided that lab leak could not be possible and that even to talk about it was racist. The first question I've always asked myself is, why is it less pejorative to think that the virus leaked from eating exotic animals? That's less racist than to think it leaked from a laboratory accident, which happens all the time. I think that whole idea that it has anything to do with racism is completely false, and she buys into that. The next problem I have with it is that, well, she's wrong. It's actually the probably likely culprit was lab leak. That's the opinion of the FBI, the Department of Energy, many other people who've looked at this. As more information comes out, that looks more likely. What kind of a reporter closes down inquiry before you even had the inquiry? That's a very poor journalist. Number two, this is an actual correction from her article. Okay, October 8th, 2021. You won't believe it. An article on Thursday about the recommended single doses of the coronavirus vaccine for children in some countries described incorrectly the actions taken by regulators in Sweden and Denmark. They halted use of Moderna in children. They have halted use of Moderna vaccine in children. They have not begun offering single doses. The article also misstated the number of COVID hospitalizations in the U.S. children. It is more than 63,000 from August 20 to October 2021, and not 900,000 since the beginning of the pandemic. She can't even tell you how many kids are being hospitalized. She says 900,000. It's 60,000. She's off by 14. Okay, and which direction is she off? Is she overselling the risk of the virus? Of course, because that's her worldview. She's never off in the other direction. What kind of a terror? It's not an error. It's bias when you're always off in one direction. In addition, the article misstated the timing of the FDA meeting on authorization of Pfizer-BioNTech. It is later this month, not next week. She doesn't even know when they're having the goddamn meeting. I mean, what are we talking about here? What kind of a reporter doesn't know how many kids are hospitalized with COVID, doesn't know what the Europeans are doing, and doesn't even know where the goddamn meeting is? I mean, why are you even reporting? Can we get somebody who knows some things? Number three, this is another correction from an article from May 19th, 2022. An earlier version of this article incorrectly referred to the number of kids aged 5 to 11 with multisystem inflammatory syndrome, or the MISC. About 4,000 have been diagnosed, not 4,000 have died with the syndrome. She says 4,000 kids died of MISC. That sounds really scary, but that was diagnosed. Actually, 68 had died with MISC. Again, she's off by many, many factors. And is she off to oversell the virus or undersell it? She only oversells it in children because she's one of the idiots who led us into school closure with her terrible misguided coverage, as you're going to see again in some more examples. And so she has to double down on that. Her errors only go in that one direction. Terrible. And the article itself was part of a broader campaign to scare parents into boosting 5 to 11-year-old children. The article title was "The CDC Recommends Pfizer-BioNTech Boosters for Kids 5 to 11. That's pretty stupid. I mean, there is literally no evidence that a healthy child who's already had and recovered from COVID needs these perpetual boosters. She's bought into that again because her worldview is skewed. She's just inserting her own medical beliefs. Maybe she should put on a white coat and go practice medicine the way she's writing. Number four. This is Apurva again on school closure. Quote, this is a tweet. Could not agree more. Children are far more resilient than we think, especially when we don't ourselves panic. The lost year narrative needs to stop. The past year has been terrible, and most middle schoolers will be fine. Parents, stop talking about the lost year, the lost year. She trivializes school closure because she was responsible for school closure. Her misguided coverage of the risk to children made people keep the schools closed for a long time. So, of course, she would be happy to think that wasn't that big a deal. Except it was a big deal. It was a catastrophic deal to those children. They already have educational attainment that's well below what was expected, and that's going to carry forward into poorer socioeconomic status, lower lifetime earnings, shorter life expectancy, probably more teen pregnancy, more gun violence, all the things that come from education, which liberals, we used to believe was a boon, and now we want to take it away for a misguided fear because Apoorva can't do math. She literally doesn't know how many kids are being hospitalized. Okay, here's another one by Apoorva. Quote, up to 70% of those infected with Ebola die compared to about 3% of those diagnosed with COVID-19. She thinks that COVID-19 has a 3% death rate. Well, that's what you might think if you were a complete buffoon. It's hard to think that if you've been reporting on COVID-19, the infection fatality rate, the rate of death from COVID-19 is a fraction. It's a fraction. It's something like people can debate between 0.125 and 0.35. You know, it's less than 1%. It's like 0.1% to 0.4%. That's the rough ballpark it's in. It's not 3%. You have to be crazy to think it's 3%. When she corrects her own article, she still exaggerates. This is the correction. Up to 70% of those diagnosed with Ebola die. The figure for those diagnosed with COVID is nowhere near as high, greater than 3% in the early days of the pandemic, and something closer to 1% or even less now. Actually, it was only 3% in one CFR report from the WHO because, again, they don't have the real denominator of who had COVID. And again, it's not even close to 1% now. It's really, really abysmally low. So, again, she's only making mistakes to exaggerate the risk of the virus. That's what she does. Number 6, she goes after Alistair Monroe, who was a guest of my podcast on this channel. You can go find that video. And Alistair Monroe says, quote, be reassured that the risk to your children is lower than the risk of seasonal flu. To which she replies, I respect your expertise, Alistair, but this comparison to flu is supremely unhelpful given the monumental COVID denialism we're all facing. So are you a journalist, or are you somebody that tells expert scientists what they should or should not be saying in public forum? She's overstepped her role. She's not a neutral journalist. She's somebody literally telling the expert on the topic, don't talk, this is not helpful. Helpful for what? For her policy quest in the New York Times office? Her desire to have more restrictions placed on kids in perpetuity? Number 7. This was what brought it all to my attention. September 23rd, she writes a column. Liv Grace. Liv Grace came down with respiratory infections 3 times over the course of 4 months. Each occurred after a visit to a medical provider in the Bay Area. MX Grace, 36, a writer who uses they-them pronouns, was infected with RSV, which led to pneumonia in December, after they were treated by a nurse wearing a surgical mask who complained about her children being ill with the virus. And then MX Grace got COVID after a visit to a cancer center for an infusion in February. And there was the pale, coughing phlebotomist who drew blood in April, just before they came down with COVID again. So Apoorva is telling the story like this person actually has the ability to know how she got sick each time. But let me tell you, the truth is, nobody knows how they're getting sick. They're just creating stories, fictional stories in their head. Because this person, Grace, could have gotten sick from the phlebotomist or the person they saw in the healthcare setting, or maybe they got sick at the grocery store or the mall. You have no clue. Are you a journalist who's concerned about facts, or are you just somebody who parrots whatever story you heard in the checkout line of the supermarket? Apoorva is the worst journalist. A basic tenet of journalism is some curiosity. If somebody says, hey, I got sick because, that guy in the gym was coughing next to me, I'd say, how do you know it was that guy? How do you know it wasn't the guy on the plane? How do you know it wasn't the guy in the supermarket? Oh, it had to be the guy in the gym, right? But how do you know? And the answer is, you don't know. They just made that up. And Apoorva just passed along that made-up information to her audience. But what's the purpose of the article? The purpose of the article is to get healthcare workers to wear mandatory masks. So Apoorva is making up some bullshit to justify her policy conclusion that she's already come to. So those are just some errors. But then I published that on my observations and thoughts. And then somebody sent me one more error by Apoorva. It says, quote, as the next presidential election gathers steam, school closures have become a centerpiece of the Republican argument that the pandemic was mishandled. Well, that's because the Republicans are correct. The Democrats were wrong to close schools. But many scientists see another lesson. Had indoor air been cleaner, closure might have been avoidable. And then she has a headline which says, bad ventilation remains a threat to all students. Well, again, she's making things up because Sweden didn't do massive ventilation campaigns and they kept elementary school open the whole time and their kids did fine. In fact, the whole country did better than average. She makes up things to fuel her narrative. This is not the hallmark of a good journalist. The science reporter, Apoorva Mandavili, is the worst science reporter I've ever seen in my life. She's done more damage for this society and on these issues of COVID policy than anyone could ever imagine. Firing Don McNeil was the worst decision the New York Times ever made, and replacing him with her in a time of crisis was terrible. When she has correction after correction, at what point do you say, you're out of this game? You can't cover this even-handedly. You said 900,000 hospitalized, it's 63,000. You said 4,000 died, that was diagnosed, not died. You don't know the IFR of the virus. Why are you covering this topic? She continues to cover the topic. The New York Times, by allowing her to continue to cover this topic, is continually misinforming their readership. And they're the reason why, I think to a large part, schools were closed in Democratic stronghold cities for so long. So Apoorva, I think the title of my article was something like, Apoorva Mandavili is a terrible science reporter working at the New York Times. And she is. And she's done a lot of damage. And I think it would be great to try to quantify that. I think that's a very tricky thing. But bad coverage in American press is why kids in this country were over-regulated and over-restricted during COVID-19. They all got COVID anyway. The vast majority before they got a vaccine. They mostly did just fine. Their lives should never have been interrupted even one day. That would have been the best policy. A lot of that damage is on her hands. Her news coverage is just absolute trash, correction after correction. She's a correction factory. They should have a separate person just in charge of her corrections, and maybe you should be able to click on a column just to see all her corrections. So that's my thoughts on her. If you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. I'll be back with more videos. I have a lot of talks I gave in Copenhagen that I'm going to be putting out there, but I think journalism has to be fair. You can't have journalists who have their own policy ideas, writing the articles, and then twisting the facts to justify their own policy and making mistakes always in one direction that happens to favor their policy. I mean, come on, who are we kidding? All right, until next time.